Thank you, Andrew, and Stephanie and Jessica for inviting us. I think my comments will be a good follow-on from what Andrew sort of laid out as far as what's been going on the past few months and where we are. My family originally is from Syria, and as Stephanie mentioned, they escaped there, were political refugees once the Baathists got into power and consolidated power in Syria. Any of the other political parties were eliminated. And one of the things I want to do is, as we add a human element to this, to realize the culture of fear that exists in Syria, that I hope as you leave here you realize that this is one of the worst regimes that exists on the planet since World War II, and that ultimately it has oppressed its people and created a culture in which brothers report on brothers, families report on other families, and that ultimately, you know, what Andrew mentioned as simply money is that people get paid off. A lot of the rallies that you may see in the cities there are simply paid rallies, and that carried over into the United States. There are actually more expatriates, Syrians, than there are in Syria because of this. And as a result, this culture of fear carries over into the behavior of Syrians in America and Europe and elsewhere, because if they speak out even in the West, their families will pay a price in Syria. And this is why you saw the State Department a few days ago call in Mr. Mustafa, the ambassador to Syria, and tell him that, you know, are you taking pictures, etc. This may have been something new to some of you, but this is basically the modus operandi for the Syrian government, is that they keep monitoring Syrian communities in the West because they want to keep a tight hold on the families there. And I think ultimately, as we look at the context of what's going to cause Syria to change, I would tell you that I'm a bit more black and white about this, is that there is no way that this government can reform. They must go. And there is no way that the people in the streets are going to go back. You can't go back. When you live under a regime that eats its young, that will imprison anybody that speaks against it, you can't one day see you go on the streets and the next day turn around and say, well, okay, now I'm going to go back and see what the president will do, because you'll disappear, because the neighborhoods will change forever. And this is why they keep pushing forward. And I think ultimately there are many things we can do to push them and help them. I do think that we need to re-look at, you know, it's interesting, many are surprised that with the change in administration that the positive poll numbers for America haven't improved. If anything, they've worsened, even though we're reportedly pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and, you know, this foreign intervention aspect is changing. And it has to do with the fact that there's still a perception that we cater to dictators, that we do not stand for anything that is clear. And I think this is an opportunity to do so, and that we need to, yesterday, not tomorrow, make it clear what the principles are that we stand for, in which that we stand with the Syrian people against oppression. When they see their government operate in a way that is inherently and intrinsically corrupt, dishonesty and lying is a way that the government operates there. So, you know, we may hear something from the news agency or the Syrian president that they're going to change, but ultimately this is just trying to buy themselves time so that the West gets out of their hair, and so that they, you know, he fired the cabinet and he's done other things that is typical. You know, it's interesting. I think that if we are going to help, not only, I think, what's in American interest, but if we're going to rebuild American credibility, I think we need to stand for a principle, whether we know what's going to happen or not. It's sort of like when you're treating cancer as a physician. You can't treat it unless you have an idea of the status of the patient and the health of the patient, but also that you have a goal, which is health in mind. If it's just sort of making time, you might as well put your patient in hospice, unless you have a principle that you're pushing for. And I think ultimately it is important that we not always try to just pick the better of two evils. Nobody can guarantee you that the Brotherhood won't gain influence after this, if there is a change, or that other interests that are anti-Western may not rise. But I do think that if you're going to have an environment that will defeat ideas like the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists in the region, they've come out of this environment. The Brotherhood grew and flourished in Hama and other places because of the oppressive environment that has been the political winter, nuclear winter that has existed in Syria now for 40 years, if not more. And one of the things I wanted to do is, as I look back at my own family history, if you look at Syrian history, after the French mandate pulled out, you had President Kouatly that was in place for a while, and then you had Hosni Zaim, who was actually a dictator, and he was then ousted 2 years later, and you had Hashim al-Attasi, Now, Hashim al-Tassi was actually a Democrat who believed in a parliamentary form of government, was a friend of my family's, and put into place. Women were voting, and you saw some reforms, true moderate democratic reforms happen. Well, he was then soon ousted, and Adib Shishakli came into power. Now, Shishakli was, again, pretty much a dictator, and you look at the history of Syria, you see this alternation, and we were talking about how many governments, 19 governments or so. Some were dictatorships, some were actually conservative and more democratic, but at the end of the day, that's an important thing for you to look at, because when we talk about what's happening in Syria now, the Ba'ath and the communists started consolidating power in the late 50s, and then ultimately when the Ba'ath came into power after they seceded back away from Egypt, and they came into power, that arrested any development politically in Syria. And they have been frozen in time for 40 years. So what you're seeing now, that they've finally gotten the will to fight the government, they're not going to leave until it changes. But it's not going to necessarily be very pretty. And this is why calling it an Arab Spring is, I don't like the term spring, you have flowers blooming, etc. I think basically they're cleaning out the driveway from a winter. And they've been buried with snow, and now they're cleaning the driveway, and they're going to be able to start creating institutions. Now, either we live by principles and help them build democratic institutions philosophically, or we just step away and continue to do sort of like we did in the whole Cold War, which was to pick the best of two evils, and that is actually what lost us our credibility. And I think ultimately, as we look at tipping points, if you look at the history of these coups, most of them were bloodless coups until 63. And again, 63 actually, Hamad was one of the tipping points. In 63 also, where there was a massacre there, and that was one of the that was a violent coup that happened. And the Ba'ath have consolidated power based on significant oppressive violence, and that's how they've stayed in power. And I think it's important that you will not see any type of metamorphosis in Syria towards moderation and towards modernism without a complete exit of the Ba'athist system. Now, again, as Andrew said, we have some family now that I know that was in the military, and the military is also a jobs program. So it doesn't mean that you're part of the party in Syria if you're in the military. But at the end of the day, if you're a leadership in the party, you're a problem. And to say that somehow you can get rid of Assad, get rid of Rifat, or get rid of some of these family people and still have a workable system with the Ba'ath in place, it's not going to happen. That party needs to go. And for us to somehow think that we can listen to the words of some of the Ba'athists and they're going to produce what they say they are, there isn't one Syrian I've ever met that believes one word that comes out of Assad or anybody in his family or any of the leaders that are in the Ba'athist regime in Syria, because they just consider them to be completely corrupt. And at the end of the day, I think many Syrians now that we've broken this culture of fear, I cannot express to you how oppressive. I haven't actually, if you see all the public work that I've done, you'll find very little that I've spoken about Syria in the past 10 years, and that's because of my family. There's concerns that when you speak out that you'll have a family that will disappear in Syria. And I think now that what's happening is happening, we have to appreciate the courage that it's taken the people in Daraa, the people in Hama, the people in Homs. And Aleppo actually is starting, and if you'll see in Aleppo, they have, the soldiers have gone in and raided universities to prevent anything from starting there, because if Aleppo and Damascus happen, it's going to be a tipping point. I would actually argue that economic sanctions would be very effective, much different than Iraq, because Iraq's economic sanctions were not necessarily effective because you didn't have an uprising happening. But what's happening is, I would tell you that Syrian families want economic sanctions, because right now they're actually yesterday were protesting on a work day, on Thursday. They're protesting on Fridays. They're protesting, and they're making a lot less money, but they're helping each other out because they have to keep the protests going. And the only people that are making money are the government. And that those, and I read Osama Manajid's op-ed in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago where he said, well, it hurts the people if you do economic sanctions. That's just not true. You have to cut off the jugular supply of economic survival of the government. And right now, you can't even find a dollar bill in Syria, from what I hear, because they are holding on to money and they don't know what to do with it, because there's not too much trade and not too much business happening in Syria. So I don't think you can underestimate the effectiveness of economic sanctions and economic pressure. The energy pressure, I think, is very important. There are a lot of Western companies from Dutch companies, Italian companies, German companies that are still operating there. Apartheid went away in South Africa because we pulled many of those governments stopped working with South Africa. I think similarly, we need to put pressure on private companies to just cut and bail and get out of there and stop doing business with Syria. I think also diplomatic pressure needs to be put on. I mean, the fact that you've got diplomats still operating freely and doing their propaganda work in the United States that are Syrian diplomats of this thuggish regime, I don't think is right. I think we need to either kick them off our soil, which would be my choice, or at least restrict their operations to 50 miles within D.C. I mean, I wrote a piece about the Consul General in L.A., who's an American citizen, Shahabi, whose father was the chief of staff of the army in Syria, who was a big donor to UC Irvine, etc. And there have been protests from Syrians who are finally speaking out about his complicity with the Syrian regime, and yet there's very little being done to push transparency with some of the diplomats. I do think that I would want to remind you that the Syrian people are in the cradle of civilization, and it is a crossroads. I think that it's an American interest. If Syria changes, you could change the hegemony in the entire region. Its complicity with Iran, with Hezbollah, and other parts of the region would be extremely hampered. And I think there's nothing more in American interest than allowing a moderate change in Syria, and especially away from Bashar Assad. And for us to think that somehow him remaining, or any type of version or permutation of the Ba'ath remaining in power, is in our interest, I think is short-sighted, because that's not stability. The radical groups, Al-Qaeda that was pushed through Syria into Iraq, the Hezbollah arming, etc. This has been done despite this era of stability that we have with Syria. It's not stable. It is a machine of radicalism. The tipping point is going to be either we're going to have somebody in the military, like the history in the 50s and 60s, that's going to come up and create a coup, or you're going to have a complete economic collapse in which you have millions in the street and the military won't be able to do anything. You'll have a complete takeover of the government. I think those are the two options. I don't see any other option. A quieting of the community, I don't think that's going to happen because they have nowhere to go. So either complete economic collapse, or there's going to be some military officers that take over and do a coup. My concern about that is don't believe everything you hear them tell you. We have to have people, UN monitors or other on the ground, to make sure that what we're told is actually what happens. And I wish my grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, my grandfather, was alive to see what's happening, because as much of a disaster and a travesty of what you see happening, every Syrian I see thinks this is good. Yes, there's people losing their lives, but what's happening is a good thing. They have been living under the worst regimes. I mean, it's like Pol Pot and Hitler. So